All right. So this is what we have for this evening. And I like to start off a conversation about emotions, which is really what we're going to focus on today with kind of a tree analogy to kind of explain where these different things come from and where do emotions really fit within the grand scheme of our biological and social system. Okay. So using the tree example, I want everybody to imagine that environmental conditions such as the place you were born, any defects within the environment, any teratogens you got when you were uh, in utero, toxins, all those kinds of things affect us at the root level. It's kind of like if you put poison in inside the ground, it will kill the tree from the bottom up, is kind of the idea behind the environmental conditions. And then we have a collective past. I know that within the Native American community, we often talk about historical trauma. Um, but it goes beyond just trauma in that in recent years, we've actually found that any type of trauma or anything that good happens within your past uh, uh, people, your genetic line, it's actually on different genetic markers. So, for example, groups like Native Americans, Jewish individuals, and Black individuals who have had a long history of trauma, we're actually finding that there is different genetic markers that indicate that traumatic past, dependent upon how much trauma that society has received, and that plays into the base or our roots of where we're at. And then, of course, our genetics and our biology. When we get into the trunk of the tree, we get into our basic drives, what drives us to exist. And this is one thing that I'll say, because this is, again, getting more down towards the biological level of our existence. Our brain's first job is not to give us consciousness. It's not to give us this world we exist in. It's not to give us logic. It is to make sure that we're biologically viable. Okay, that we're alive, that our body is functioning. Okay, and based on that, we have some very basic drives that as for example, when we were talking about the biological systems, sits within the brain stem, that area between the spinal cord and the upper areas of the brain that include the cortex and all of those areas. And within this brainstem system, we have our basic drives. So what are our basic drives? Well, we know we have the drive to of hunger and thirst, right? The drive to have shelter. And those are our three most basic drives that make us survive. Um, then we have our sex drive and our love drive. And I kind of want to make sure that we differentiate between the two. Is that recent research has shown that the area of the brain that controls who you fall in love with are not the emotional areas of the brain. They are housed within the brain stem. Okay. Meaning that love and the drive to bond with someone is not a motivation, it's not an emotion, it's not a feeling, it's a basic drive that then give a way to the motivation and emotions to seek out a partner of some type. This is also different from the sex drive, the mating drive, as you would say. So here's an area where Freud was right, is we have a drive, an area of the brainstem that is driven towards mating and sexual activity. And I do also want to say is that your intimate romantic drive and your sex drive are two separate areas of the brain. In fact, we can see it even in the higher cortical areas. Your circuitry to find someone to bond with goes along the left side of your brain. The sex drive goes along the right side, and they're two separate tracks. Okay. And so, for example, when we talk about gender and gender identity and sexual identity, we'll talk about two groups of people, people who are asexual and people who are aromantic. Okay. The A part of it means absence of. Okay. So, for example, we'll all experience a time in our life where sex is just not that appealing, or being in a relationship is just not something we want right now. Okay. But there are certain groups of people where those lack of desires exist throughout their life cycle. Okay. So there's individuals who are asexual who live their life not wanting sex. Okay. And there's also a group of people who go through life not wanting an intimate relationship. Okay. But the two are separate. You can be asexual, but still want an intimate relationship, still want to have a bonding, loving relationship. You can also be aromantic, but still have a high sex drive. Okay. And that's what I mean by these two systems are separate. The reason we combine them is because of culture and socialization, that we think if we're in an intimate relationship, we also have need to have a sexual relationship. But from a biological perspective, these two systems are separate from each other. Okay, so based on these drives, when we get hungry, we have desires, we get thirsty, we need to go have shelter. This gives a way to motivation. Okay, motivation is going to become from the trunk to where things start to branch off, as we'll see here in a moment with our example. Motivation is a thing that gets us moving to alleviate any of the drives we have. Okay. And then this gives off to the branches, which is our emotional state. Okay. Which the reason why we put these in the branches is because this is the part of the tree that is most influenced by the environment itself. Emotions are what we call a situationally bound experience, okay? Because in order to have an emotion, you have to be within a certain situation. So, for example, if you want to be happy, you have to be in a situation that elicits the emotion of happiness, okay? And then feelings are the leaves. They're the things that emotions affect. Okay, so if the branch starts to die, for example, the leaves will start to die. If the branch is really healthy, the leaves thrive. All right. And then we need to talk about, you'll notice over here we have what's called affect. Affect is just the overall health of our tree. Okay. And this can be moment for moment. Some days I have a really tired affect, meaning that I'm just kind of drained of energy. And then other days I can have a very positive affect where I get a lot of things done. I'm excited, all of those things. But in general, most of the time we are kind of in the middle range of affect, dependent upon things like our temperament and again these roots of what gives way to our drives. Okay, so this is just kind of an example of the overall model of of what gives way to our emotions and our motivations. Okay. But I want to take a closer look at the difference between emotions and feelings. Now, generally in society and general conversations, we use emotions and feelings interchangeably. Okay. But when we're talking about it in this class, I want us to have two very clear definitions of when I say the word emotions and when I say the word feelings, I want all of you to understand what definitions I'm using for both. Okay. So when I talk about emotions, um, which precede feelings. I'm talking about those things that play out in the theater of the body. Okay. Your emotions are your physiological reactions to some stimulus or situation in your environment. Okay. So if we go, for example, back to biology when we were talking about the fight flight response. Okay. The emotion when you see something dangerous is that emotion of fear, that emotion of androgens being released. It is the signaling device from your body saying, "Hey, pay attention. There's something wrong." Additionally, when we're releasing endorphins and stuff like that, your body is saying, "Hey, we're in a safe place. In fact, we're in a happy place for that matter of fact." Okay. Feelings, on the other hand, play out in the theater of the mind. Okay. And they precede emotions. Feelings are our interpretation of our emotional state. Okay. I'm going to say that one more time. Feelings are an interpretation of our physiological reaction to a situation. Okay. Now, why is it important to separate these two? Why is it important to give these two separate terms? Well, our feelings come from our development, okay? They come from our experience of the emotion, and our response to that emotion then gives us our what we're going to give up next time. It gives to our schema of what we should do in a given situation. And the best way to explain this, and I don't know if I've done this in the class, but the best way to explain this is when I worked with domestic violence survivors who tended to get in and out of really bad relationships. Now, for some, not all, it can be traced back to their childhood experiences, because a lot of individuals that get in and out of abusive relationships tended to come from abusive homes where the parents were very abusive and chaotic and harmful homes. Okay, neglectful, I should say, not harmful. And if you think about it, the archetype of what love should be is the parent, specifically the mother, because the mother represents nurturing, she represents caring, she represents all of those things that the emotion of love ignites. Okay. So if you imagine, we have this kind of built-in emotional archetype of what love should be in the environment. Okay. But then we have a very abusive, harmful, hurtful mother. So in this situation, the emotion of love is interpreted as pain, meaning love equals pain. All right. So the emotion, love, the interpretation, pain. So then when that individual then gets into relationships later in life, and they get into a relationship that doesn't bring about pain, they tend to be very uncomfortable with it. And so they tend to be attracted towards those relationships that meet their schema of what a relationship should feel like. What I shouldn't say relationship, I should say what love should feel like. Okay. And so in a lot of cases, working with women, I think there was one guy I worked with that we did this, when they say, "Okay, I'm ready to get back out there and start dating again." We would purposely say, "Okay, you don't date the person that you're comfortable with. You date the person you're uncomfortable with." Okay. And what we found, or the individuals I worked with, and one example is a lady I worked with that just came from a very horrible relationship over and over and over. And she did this, "I'm going to date someone uncomfortable." And he was a very caring, kind man. And she admitted it took her a year or two to actually fall in love with him. but she knew that this is what she needed to do. And since then, I think, gosh, man, they've been married now for 21 years. Very happy, very successful, no more abuse, no more getting in ugly situations. And and again, it goes back to that experience of that mislabeling based on feelings and what the emotion was trying to tell the individual. Okay. And this is why we separate these two when we talk about the psychology of emotions and feelings. Okay. Now we do need to make a qualification to this because later in the course we're going to talk about what happens when these emotion systems go awry. Okay. And we need to recognize that things like mood disorders, such as depression, bipolar, stress disorders, and disorders and post-traumatic stress disorders is when these systems get hijacked, either due to experience, due to trauma, due to the interaction between the environment and genetic predispositions. So when we talk about things like depression and bipolar, I want you to think about these emotion systems were basically hijacked. Okay. And even when we talk about things like psychosis and schizophrenia and something called dissociative disorders, in these, individuals can experience very positive symptoms and very negative symptoms. And those emotional symptoms tend to be incongruent with the situation. Okay, meaning it's an individual who might be very hysterical when the situation demands them to be calm. Okay. Um, and then trauma, when not resolved appropriately, can also influence how these systems work. Okay. And so I just want to make sure that we have this special case in mind. But that's also why, again, going back to the emotions, feelings, dynamics, that's why we find that the best course of treatment, especially for mood disorders and stress disorders, is a combination of biological intervention, taking care of the the physiological, emotional response that has been hijacked, and therapy, which will work on the feeling component, the cognitive component, and the schema component of that system that has been hijacked. Okay. So I just wanted to bring up this special case because um, not all of our systems are operating to help us out in some cases. Okay. So some of the qualities of emotions is that they are situationally bound, meaning that emotions from a physiological perspective don't transcend the current situation we're in. The reason why we might think that we carry negative emotions with us is because we carry them. Okay. But one of the things that I try to teach in, for example, my counseling and therapy classes is that when you go into a counseling room, you take your emotions out of your head outside the therapy room and you set it right there. You let it be there in that situation. And then you go back, you go into that room and you have a new situation that then can then have different bound emotions with it. Um, And then feelings, of course, are the cognitive component, and the primary purpose of an emotion is to signal to us that something is going on that either we need to fix or we need to do more of. Okay. Said that. So I want to bring up a special case of emotions as kind of an example of what we're talking about. And what I want to do is talk for a little while about loneliness and social rejection and our need to affiliate. Because as I said, one of our primary drives is to affiliate with each other. Okay. And so I'm going to use this as kind of a springboard to kind of talk about and provide an example of what we mean about emotions and feelings, okay? Because what makes loneliness unique is that it's actually what we call a negative emotional motivational state, okay? And what's meant by that? Well, the emotion part of it is that we've lost something, and we're feeling like we need to protect ourselves from experiencing that loss again. Okay, so this is the negative emotional component of loneliness, is our body is signaling to us to protect ourselves. And so we find that individuals who tend to be severely lonely tend to be very highly hypervigilant. They tend to be wary about other people. Uh, but on the interesting part of it is that we actually become more attuned to reading people more correctly, more accurately than when we're in a non-lonely state, because that's a protective device. At the same time, so if we want to put this in relation to brain mechanism, this negative emotional state is operating on the serotonin level, the amygdala level. And amygdala, if you remember, its primary emotional response is fear. Okay, so this is a serotonin system that is occurring right here. Then we have a motivational state at the same time that's trying to promote us to make those social connections that we've lost, to make it so that we're not experiencing this state anymore. And this, if you want to relate it to motivation, is a dopaminological system or dopamine system. So we have these two counter type of situations going. We're having a fear response, but at the same time, we're releasing dopamine to try and get us to socialize more. And that's why some of the risks of loneliness, as we'll see here in a little while, tend to be self-destructive behaviors because we're so confused about what we're supposed to be doing. Now we know that there's two types of loneliness. The first one is social loneliness. It's also known in the literature, if you look it up, social isolation. And this is experienced when a person doesn't feel like they have sufficient number of social connections. Okay. Not necessarily social relationships, but social connections. And the best example of this is friend connections on like TikTok or Instagram or Facebook. Okay. There's some people that can have 10 friends and they're perfectly okay. They feel like they feel connected to their world. There's other people who feel like they need to have thousands of friends on one of those social media sites in order to feel like they're connected to the world. Okay. And this is very much a subjective experience. Some of us need a few people, some of us need a lot of people. Okay. Emotional loneliness, on the other hand, is the experience when we have a loss of a close, emotionally connected relationship, someone that we have an emotional bond with. So this could be a loss of a parent, a spouse or a partner, a child. So this is that type of relationship we're talking about. And again, these two can work together. So, I had a friend, I had one friend who, if she had a problem, she could call me and we'd work it out and she'd be okay with it. I had this other female friend that would call me, then she would call her mom, and then she'd call another friend, and then she would call a sibling, and she'd have to make all of these different using these emotional relationships in order to feel more resolved about their situation. Okay. Now, loneliness needs to be um, differentiated from what we call social rejection. Okay. Um, because social rejection is different than loneliness. Loneliness gets us to experience, it's more long term. Okay. Social rejection is when someone breaks up with us or we're rejected by a social group of some type. Okay. And one of the paradigms that is used in this is we put individuals in an MRI machine and we have them do a kind of a video game called Speedball. Okay. And in this, there's just basically three dots in a screen, and you have a ball and you throw that ball to person A, that person throws it to person B, and then that person throws it back to you. And this cycles over and over and over. But what eventually starts to happen is person A starts to throw it to B, and B throws it back to A, and A throws it back to B, and excludes or rejects throwing it to you. Okay. And we measure what area of the brain is occurring here. Okay. And what we find is it's not the amygdala, it's not the motivational systems that start to turn on. It is actually the not the dopamine system, the opioid system that turns on, meaning the physical pain areas of the brain turn on when we experience social rejection. Not the emotional area, not the motivational area, but the same area of the brain that when you break your arm or you cut your finger, that's the area that turns on when you experience social rejection. And in fact, if you're dumped, if you're rejected by a group, the best cure we have found today is actually Tylenol. We found that if you take Tylenol at about 325 milligrams per day for about 4 days, your feelings of rejection will actually go away. Not the loneliness, but the feelings of being rejected by that group. Okay. And so there's something to consider when you're dealing with rejection and loneliness. Yes, you have to deal with the loneliness aspect of it, but if you want to get rid of that feeling of rejection, using a more biological type of intervention works better than a psychological or an emotional intervention. So something kind of consider. All right, I'm going to skip this. All right, I just want to bring this up because what we're going to talk about is identity and how this plays into our emotional system. So how we think about ourselves give way to our emotional and states, and why is that important? So we've already talked about this when we went through the Erickson model, so I won't spend too much time about it, about the self-concept. Remember, the self-concept is that thing, everything that you can say is you. And if you remember, we talked about the personal self or personal identity. Those are the things that um, those are the things that make you unique compared to the person sitting next to you. Your social identity is all of those things that are given to you by your social world. Okay. And you'll notice in this diagram, in our original diagram, there can be overlap between our personal self and our social identity. So, for example, if you feel that your gender is something unique to you, that being a strong woman makes you unique compared to other people in the room, for example. That's a social identity that has fused with who you are, who you feel makes you unique as a human being. Okay. So that's kind of the difference between that original model we looked at Erickson and the one I want you to think of right here. So how does how you think about yourself relate to that emotional motivational state of loneliness? Okay. And so we're going to look at these two. So in the blue one, we have emotional loneliness. In this, what is that? Salmon colored one, I think it is. We have social loneliness. And just so you know, these two bars here and these two bars here are what we call control conditions. And what these control conditions do is they establish a baseline for each of these types of loneliness, meaning that if I were just to go measure loneliness in a general population, I would establish this baseline. So this is what I would expect if I just went out and measured it, that's where it would be at. The two conditions I want you to pay attention to are these two, the social identity and the personal identity areas, okay? And this is a very simple task that we had individuals do. In the social identity, we did it with many identities, but originally it was done with simply asking someone, what are 5 positive things about being a student? Okay. And so they would list those 5 things, and then they would do a measure of loneliness. Okay. In the second condition, we'd ask, what are 5 positive things that make you a unique human being? And then we'd give a measure of loneliness. Okay. And what we found is, and again, this is the interaction between those feelings, what we think about ourselves and the emotions we experience. When we think about ourselves as it is connected to things that are external to us, so being a student, being an employee, being a father, mother, when we think of ourselves as it's connected to the broader world, we tend to be less lonely. In fact, we're less lonely than baseline, what you would expect in the average. When we think about ourselves, even when we're thinking positively about our uniqueness in the world, we're almost twice as lonely as baseline and 3 times as lonely as when we think about ourselves as we're connected to our social world. Okay. So how and in what way we think about ourselves really drives our emotional systems. In this case, we're using the example of loneliness. But we find this experience when we're dealing with even positive and negative emotions that go beyond what we're talking about as this example. Okay. And so I mentioned, so when we let these emotions drive us, especially the negative components of it, what happens? So in box number 1, or this number 1, we have denial, loss, or damage to, for example, our social identity or our identity of who we are. Okay. In this case, it leads us to ask, where do I belong in this world? Which leads to social loneliness, feeling like we're not connected to it in some way. And we also ask, who do I belong? And this leads us to things like emotional loneliness, not feeling like we have emotional close relationships in the world. And this leads to something we call failure to belong. If this continues, it leads to what we call in box 3, failure to survive. Okay. Now, what do these things result in? Because this now is getting into more of the abnormal type of psychology that I know the class is interested in. This lack or emotional disconnection from our world can lead to, for example, lower mortality rates. Mortality is the probability of when someone is going to pass away, or their life is going to come to some type of end. Okay. And we actually find that loneliness independently predicts, meaning it has nothing to do with these variables. It independently predicts mortality as good as, or if not better than, your exercising habits, your eating habits, or smoking habits. Meaning that you could be the most physically healthy person in the world and eat absolutely right, but if you are you have extended periods of this emotional state of loneliness, you're going to not have an extended life as much as a person who eats Twinkies all day and sits around and watches TV. All right. I'm going to qualify this later about suicide. I'll talk about it here in just a few minutes. We know that people who have extended loneliness are more likely to have addiction. We find that people who have extended loneliness have higher morbidity rate, morbidity being the probability of getting some type of disease, illness, chronic sickness, heart disease, cancer, diabetes, all of those types of things. And in fact, we have actually found that extended periods of loneliness actually will change the genetic code for your immune system, meaning that your immune system genetic code reduces your immune response to given terrogens or toxins in the environment. We find that this is related to things like homelessness, relationship issues, psychological mood disorders such as depression, criminal behaviors. Gang affiliations, when I mention gang affiliations, this comes from studies of intercity gangs. Yes. Because what we find is that remember that negative emotional state. So you become very hyper vigilant, you become very wary and distrusting. And so even if you do have a relationship, and we see this a lot with, for example, people who are in a healthy relationship, but let's say one of the partners loses their parent. Or a better example is when a couple who has a children loses that child. Okay. The probability of a relationship staying together after losing a child is very, very low. Okay. Because they've lost that emotional connection, which is creating a huge amount of emotional loneliness. And they become very wary of each other and very hyper vigilant and very conflictive because they're trying to protect themselves from experiencing that emotional loss again. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. Good question. Very good question. Back into the inner city part is we find that, well, when we look at inner city gang affiliations, the gangs don't look for the individuals who are gaining success in the world, those who are going to jobs and working, going to school. No, they purposely look for individuals to recruit into the gangs that feel like they're disconnected from the community. They feel like they're lost and no one supports them. Okay. And that's their main recruitment strategy, is to find these individuals who need a place to belong. Okay. And that's why gangs kind of have that mantra of you stay with us, we'll protect you, you'll protect us. And think about that emotional and social bonding that is occurring when someone is being groomed into a specifically inner city gangs is where this has been studied. Okay. And so these are all kind of some consequences to think about when we talk about when emotions don't, we don't use emotions to drive our behaviors, and they can have these very negative consequences. Now, I won't talk, we'll get into this when we get into social psychology, because there's a dark side of social identity. While there's all these positive reasons to have a healthy social identity, when we get into social psychology, we'll come back to this topic, because it's our identity with our social world that sets up the grounds for prejudice and discrimination to occur. But I'm going to put a pause on that slide, and we'll talk about it when we get to that section on prejudice and discrimination. Okay. So what I want to do is just wrap up some information about identity and loneliness and what happens based on current research that was done in 23 and one that came out in 24, so that you have some perspective on what it is some researchers are now researching based upon these results or these the state that we've gone over. Okay, so the reason why I put this on a separate slide is when we live in a Native American group, we tend to have conflicting identities between your identity as a Native American and your identity of the broader culture, that broader colonized culture in the United States. And some of these times, these can become conflictual, okay? And so what you et al. Found is that when we have these competing identities, it becomes time bound, and uh, individuals lose the ability or they have difficulties planning for their future. Okay, meaning that these individuals who have these conflicting identities get stuck in the present and have a hard time moving forward with their life. And so when we think about things like poverty, when we think, and this isn't just Native Americans, we could look at Black communities, definitely the Asian American communities, we find this. A lot of the issues and problems we find is that when we have these conflicting identities, we become time bound. We get stuck where we're at in the moment or in the present and have difficulty moving on and planning for the future. So that's something to think about and consider when you're considering your own identity and which one you should place as the predominant one for you. Some other research. So I mentioned that this suicide issue earlier, and what we have found is that the major driver of most suicides is a combination of depression and loneliness. Okay. And so I'm going to give a couple examples from other research besides Ehrman. They did meta-analysis to determine this relationship. And so we're going to look at people who are hospitalized because of depression versus suicidality. So there are some people who go to the ER room because they just can't handle the symptoms of depression. They're not suicidal. They've just gotten to such a point with their symptoms of depression that they go and admit themselves into the ER. And then, of course, there's individuals who go to the ER because they had a suicide attempt. Okay. And so what researchers did in this area is they went in and they gave these individuals a measure of depression and a measure of loneliness. Okay. And of course, both groups scored really high on the scale of depression. Okay. The difference is the depression group didn't score any higher in loneliness than the general population would. It was only among the individuals who were in there for suicidal attempts or suicidal ideation that scored significantly higher than the general population on the scale of loneliness. Okay. So there's that evidence that was given. And then the other evidence actually comes from my own research, where what years were they again? 2014, 15, and 16. I took all of the mortuary, what are they called? No, the person who evaluates why someone passed away. Oh, what is it? Anyone on Zoom help me out with this term? The person who evaluates.
A coroner?
Coroner, thank you. Thank you. I don't know why that word has a hard time coming out of my mind. Okay, I evaluated the coroner reports in 2014, 15, and 16 for the state of Montana. Why the state of Montana? Because Montana and Alaska switch places almost yearly for the highest rates of suicides in the United States. And so it was a good place to kind of look at these relationships. And so we reviewed the coroner reports for that 3-year period, and we found that there were two primary things that preceded a suicide. Okay. For the majority of it, we found that they either just lost a job, they were going through a divorce, or they had a close death in their family. Okay. So again, loss of that social connection leading to that loneliness but loneliness plus depression equation. For a more minor few of them, it was because they had some type of chronic illness that couldn't be treated in any way. So there's a very common one is there's a disorder where you constantly hear ringing in your ears, and it's constantly there. And that disorder specifically tends to lead to the highest rates of suicide among those individuals who commit due to a chronic illness. Okay. So that's the relation there. Zhang et al. Found that exolemia, which then leads to loneliness, leads to what we call non-suicidal self-injury in adolescence. So these are individuals who do self-harm, such as cutting or burning or high-risk behaviors that lead to injury. Now, what exolemia is and it's a disorder mostly in adolescence where an individual is unable to give the proper label to their emotions, and don't understand the emotional states of other individuals. Okay. Now it's different than someone who, for example, is narcissistic or someone who is psychopathic. These young people have emotions. They just don't know how to give it a label. Okay. And we find that tends to be that combination of loneliness and anemia tend to lead to a lot of self-injuring behaviors in an adolescence. 223 again, Yerk found that social connection and decreasing loneliness in middle school actually reduces dropout rates in high school. So what they did is they randomly assigned middle schools to some of the middle schools just operated as normal. In other middle schools, they spent a significant amount of time talking about social skills, promoting the identity of being a part of the middle school, talked about social connection and all those kinds of things. And what they found is that the kids who went to the middle school that promoted social connection had less dropout rates than the high schools that ran as normal. Okay, indicating that there is something that occurs during that period of time where kids who lose connection tend to have higher dropout rates. Okay, the next one is we found that older adults who maintain career social connections after retirement live longer and healthier versus those who say, oh, I'm finally in my retirement years, I could leave my job behind. They tend to live a shorter and less healthy life. Jordan 23 found that social connection and as a self-care strategy. And this is one of the points I want to leave you with today. Okay. Social connection, calling a friend, writing someone a text or an email, spending time with someone close to you, going to Starbucks as a method of self-care has been found to be better than any of the more traditional strategies, such as medication, therapy, meditation, exercise, meaning what I want you to do self-care during the spring break is, yes, do relax, but spend a good amount of time with your family and friends, because that will do more for you than traditional self-care strategies do. So I'm going to leave you with that thought. But then the other thing is, as I mentioned earlier, that loneliness is the best, as good or better predictor of when we will when our life will come to its natural end of cycle. Is recently we've tried to understand why this is, and we have found that social isolation, social loneliness actually influences how the brain ages, meaning that social isolation speeds up how fast your brain ages. So something to keep in mind. So that's my example of the interaction between emotions and our world, and why when we talked about developmental psychology, we said you can't separate social from your emotional world. Okay. And so I'm going to get out of here. Stop sharing.